Caroline Leavitt had become accustomed to the weight of the spotlight. As the youngest White House press secretary in American history, she carried the burden of relentless scrutiny with a steady hand and unwavering confidence. Every day, she stood at the podium in the James S. Brady press briefing room, fielding questions from an often hostile press corps, her sharp intellect and poised demeanor making her both a respected figure and a lightning rod for controversy. Her role under President Donald Trump placed her at the heart of the nation's most polarizing debates, and she navigated them with skill, never shying away from her deeply held conservative and religious beliefs. Beyond the confines of the White House, however, Caroline's presence was not always welcomed. Her rise to prominence had made her a cultural symbol, admired by some, despised by others. She understood that power came with resistance, but she refused to apologize for who she was. Washington, D.C., a city steeped in political allegiances, was a battlefield of ideology, and she had learned to expect resistance in spaces that once prided themselves on inclusivity. After a particularly grueling day handling the media storms surrounding a new policy rollout, Caroline decided to unwind with a few colleagues at a high-end restaurant in the heart of D.C. It was a place known for its modern ambience and upscale clientele, frequented by politicians, lobbyists, and journalists alike. The evening was meant to be a brief escape from the chaos of political life, a rare opportunity to enjoy a meal without the pressure of the cameras or the weight of carefully crafted statements. As she entered the restaurant, she immediately sensed a shift in atmosphere. A quiet hum of recognition passed through the staff, a few sideways glances exchanged between employees. She was used to this reaction. Her face had become one of the most recognizable in American politics. Some diners stole discreet looks in her direction, while others turned away, feigning disinterest. Caroline ignored it. She had long since mastered the art of composure in the face of judgment. She and her colleagues were seated near the center of the dining room, the warm glow of chandeliers casting a soft light over the table. Conversation flowed easily among them, a welcome reprieve from the rigidity of the press room. The group shared laughter, discussing everything from policy debates to weekend plans. For a brief moment, Caroline allowed herself to relax, to relish the simple pleasure of good company and fine dining. But the tension in the air did not dissipate. Subtle yet unmistakable, it lingered like an unspoken challenge. The staff moved around them with a noticeable stiffness, their smiles forced, their glances quick and wary. At first, Caroline dismissed it as standard discomfort from those who disapproved of her politics. It was not unusual for high-profile figures to elicit strong reactions. Then, a distinct shift occurred. The whispers became more pronounced. A server hesitated before approaching their table, exchanging a glance with another employee before stiffly taking their drink orders. Across the room, the restaurant's manager, Tom Bradford, stood with his arms crossed, watching her with a thinly veiled air of disapproval. Caroline recognized the look instantly. It was not the curious gaze of an observer, nor the wary glance of someone intimidated by her status. It was the expression of a man who had already made up his mind about her, one who had passed judgment before she had even spoken a word. She remained unbothered. If years in politics had taught her anything, it was that respect was not always given freely. She had never expected approval from those who disagreed with her, nor had she ever needed it. But what she did expect, what every American deserved, was the basic courtesy afforded to any patron in a public establishment. As her colleagues continued their conversation, Caroline caught the moment Tom Bradford began making his way toward their table. His expression remained unreadable, but there was an unmistakable air of authority in his posture. This was not a casual approach. This was an intention, a decision already made. Caroline set down her glass of water, her instincts sharpening. The moment she had unknowingly walked into was about to unfold, and she was ready for whatever came next. The atmosphere in the restaurant grew tense as Tom Bradford approached Caroline's table with slow, deliberate steps. His expression was neutral, but there was a glint of purpose in his eyes, a certainty in his posture that suggested he had been waiting for this moment. Caroline, attuned to even the smallest shifts in tone and body language, could sense what was coming before he even opened his mouth. The hum of conversation around them softened as diners took notice. A few heads turned discreetly, while others pretended not to pay attention, their curiosity betrayed by sideways glances. The waitstaff, who had been circulating the room with careful precision, seemed suddenly hesitant, their movements cautious as if anticipating an unavoidable confrontation. Without any pleasantries, Tom addressed her, his tone clipped and authoritative. His words were curt, an unmistakable dismissal wrapped in the guise of professional decorum. His message was clear: she was not welcome here. The reasoning, he made sure to emphasize, had nothing to do with her as a customer, but everything to do with who she was outside these walls. Her position, her political affiliation, and her personal beliefs had made her presence unacceptable in his establishment. For a brief moment, Caroline processed the weight of the accusation. It was not unfamiliar to her. She had spent years enduring baseless criticisms, enduring the ire of those who saw her as nothing more than a representative of a movement they despised. But here, in this moment, she was not standing at the White House podium, engaged in the cut and thrust of political debate. She was simply a private citizen, seated at a restaurant, seeking nothing more than a meal with friends. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. For years, she had listened to those who championed inclusivity and tolerance, only to watch them wield those ideals selectively. Now, the very people who spoke of acceptance had no problem ostracizing someone based on ideology. She had heard of stories like this before: people denied service, jobs, or opportunities because their beliefs did not align with the dominant cultural narrative, but now, she was at the center of one. Remaining composed, she calmly sought clarification. Perhaps this was a misunderstanding, an instance of miscommunication. But Tom's response left no room for doubt. He was firm in his decision, making it clear that her presence alone was a disruption. He did not cite any specific actions or statements that had violated the restaurant's policies. Her mere existence in the space, coupled with what she represented, was offense enough. Her colleagues immediately voiced their objections. Some leaned forward, indignation flickering in their expressions as they argued against the absurdity of the situation. Others, aware of the public nature of the confrontation, glanced around the room, noting the way other diners were watching. A few pulled out their phones, capturing the unfolding exchange, their screens glowing with the promise of an inevitable viral moment. Caroline, however, did not raise her voice. She had spent too many years under scrutiny to let anger dictate her response. She calmly pointed out the dangerous precedent being set, that denying service based on political or religious beliefs was not just unjust but contrary to the principles of fairness and respect. She reminded him that businesses, especially those in a city like Washington, D.C., serve people of all political backgrounds every day without issue. Tom's reaction was nothing short of dismissive. His smirk barely concealed his satisfaction, as if he relished the moment of exerting control over someone whose influence extended far beyond the walls of this restaurant. He countered with a sneering remark, implying that while she may have the freedom to speak and operate within the halls of the White House, she held no power here. In his establishment, he made the rules, and in his eyes, she did not belong. A silence settled over the restaurant. Some diners avoided eye contact, while others watched with barely concealed intrigue. A few murmured among themselves, clearly unsettled by what they were witnessing. The weight of the moment pressed down on the space, heavy with the realization that something significant was unfolding. Caroline took a measured breath. She could have fought back, could have argued further, could have turned the moment into a larger spectacle. But she understood that her greatest weapon in this moment was not outrage, but dignity. Rising from her seat, she gathered her belongings, her movements slow and deliberate. There would be no scene, no dramatic outburst, only the quiet power of composure in the face of blatant injustice. Her colleagues followed suit, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others offering her reassuring glances. The group made their way toward the exit, the hushed conversations of onlookers following them. The air felt charged, as if everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something that would extend far beyond the walls of the restaurant. The night outside was crisp, the cool air offering a sharp contrast to the heat of the moment they had just left behind. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, one of her colleagues checked their phone, the screen already alight with notifications. The video of the encounter had been posted online, and within minutes, it had begun to spread. What had started as a private dinner had now become a national conversation. The morning after the incident, Caroline awoke to the now familiar sensation of her phone vibrating relentlessly on her nightstand. Even before she opened her eyes, she knew what awaited her. The previous night's events had been too public, too charged to remain a quiet moment of indignation. By now, the country was watching. As she reached for her phone, the notifications blurred together in an overwhelming flood of headlines, mentions, and opinion pieces. The video, captured from multiple angles inside the restaurant, had exploded across social media overnight. Clips circulated on news channels and online platforms, dissected and analyzed by pundits and activists alike. The debate was no longer about one woman being denied service, it had become a referendum on the state of political discourse in America. Mainstream media outlets quickly took their positions. Left-leaning networks framed the story as a triumph, painting the restaurant as a bold example of resistance against an administration they had long opposed. Some journalists described the refusal of service as an act of moral defiance, celebrating the manager's decision to turn her away. A few columnists went further, arguing that public figures aligned with conservative politics should expect rejection in spaces that prided themselves on progressive values. There was an undercurrent of mockery in the coverage, with certain pundits gleefully suggesting that Caroline had finally gotten a taste of her own medicine. The tone across conservative media was drastically different. Prominent voices pointed out the glaring hypocrisy of the situation, questioning whether the public reaction would have been the same had the roles been reversed. Had a liberal official been expelled from a conservative-owned business, the outcry would have been immediate and deafening. Some commentators called it an attack on free speech, while others saw it as a direct assault on religious liberty. The restaurant's actions, they argued, were proof of a growing intolerance toward those who dared to express traditional or right-leaning beliefs. The story quickly became political fuel. Supporters of the administration rallied behind Caroline, decrying the blatant discrimination, while opponents viewed the incident as justified retribution. Protesters gathered outside the restaurant, some condemning the treatment she had endured, others praising it as an act of necessary resistance. The divide had been drawn, and like so many cultural flashpoints before, it was no longer just about what had happened to her. It had become a battle over the broader issue of ideological exclusion in public life. Inside the White House, the communications team worked rapidly to assess the situation. Calls poured in from media outlets requesting official statements, while administration allies urged a strong response. Caroline, however, was not interested in fanning the flames. She had no intention of playing the victim, nor did she want the narrative to be one of personal grievance. Her role had always been about delivering a message, about shaping discourse, and she intended to do exactly that. As she stepped into the James S. Brady press briefing room that afternoon, the tension in the air was unmistakable. The room was packed with reporters, many of whom had already aired their opinions on the incident. Cameras clicked furiously as she approached the podium, poised and unshaken. With measured confidence, she addressed the nation. She did not dwell on personal indignation, nor did she attack those who had celebrated her expulsion. Instead, she framed the moment as a test of the country's commitment to the principles it claimed to uphold. She spoke of fairness, of the importance of open discourse, of the danger in creating spaces where only one ideology was permitted to exist. She reminded the press that tolerance was meaningless if it only applied selectively. If Americans were to truly stand for inclusivity, then that inclusivity had to extend to those they disagreed with. She made it clear that this was not about her, nor about one restaurant, it was about a growing cultural shift that punished individuals for their beliefs rather than engaging with them. The statement was firm but composed, unshakable in its message. By the time she left the podium, the room was buzzing. Reporters scrambled to analyze her words, while political figures across the spectrum reacted in real time. Some praised her poise, others dismissed it as spin, but no one could deny that she had taken control of the narrative. As she walked back toward her office, her phone buzzed with messages from allies and critics alike. But she did not need to read them to know one thing for certain: she had refused to be silenced. Within hours of Caroline's press briefing, the tide of public reaction took a decisive turn. What had initially been celebrated by left-leaning media as an act of defiance against the Trump administration was now being questioned by a wider audience. The conversation had shifted from partisan cheerleading to a broader discussion on fairness, hypocrisy, and the dangerous precedent of political discrimination. The backlash against the restaurant was swift. Conservative commentators and grassroots activists mobilized, calling for a boycott of the establishment. Hashtags condemning the expulsion trended across social media, with thousands of users expressing their outrage. They argued that no one, regardless of political affiliation, should be denied service for their beliefs. What caught many by surprise, however, was the reaction beyond conservative circles. While some progressive voices continued to defend the restaurant's decision, others, particularly moderate liberals and independents, began voicing unease. The idea of politicizing restaurants, of turning businesses into ideological battlegrounds, struck many as a step too far. Loyal patrons of the restaurant, even those who had no love for the Trump administration, admitted they felt uncomfortable with the thought of exclusion based on political identity. News crews soon stationed themselves outside the restaurant, eager to capture reactions from diners and employees alike. The footage painted a complicated picture. While some customers praised the restaurant's actions, others hesitated, uncomfortable with the hostility that now surrounded the once popular establishment. A few quietly admitted they would think twice before dining there again, not because they necessarily supported Caroline, but because the incident had left a bitter taste in their mouths. The scrutiny inevitably fell on Tom Bradford. At first, he welcomed the attention, reveling in what he saw as a moment of moral victory. He believed his decision had positioned him as a figure of principled resistance, a man standing against what he viewed as dangerous rhetoric from the administration. However, as the days passed, the once supportive coverage became more complicated. Reporters pressed him on whether his decision had been purely ideological, questioning if he would have treated a liberal official the same way in a conservative-owned business. His responses were curt, defensive, and at times dismissive, further fueling the criticism. When asked if he worried about the precedent his actions had set, he brushed off concerns, confident that he had done the right thing. But the pressure did not relent. As national attention continued to grow, prominent figures across the political spectrum began weighing in. Conservative lawmakers condemned the treatment of Caroline as blatant discrimination, calling for protections against political exclusion in public spaces. More surprisingly, even some liberal politicians expressed concerns. While they made clear that they did not align with Caroline's politics, they questioned whether this type of behavior was truly representative of the inclusivity they championed. Editorials emerged in mainstream publications debating the ethics of the situation. Some opinion pieces continued to defend Tom's right as a business owner to refuse service, but more and more articles warned against the slippery slope of political segregation. If this was acceptable now, many asked, where would the line be drawn in the future? Despite the mounting controversy, the White House remained firm. Caroline refused to apologize for her beliefs, nor did she entertain the notion that she should have stayed silent. Her response had been measured, focused on principle rather than personal grievance, and that refusal to engage in outrage had only strengthened her position. As Tom Bradford stood before the cameras, still convinced of his righteousness, he failed to notice what was happening around him. The conversation was no longer about one restaurant's decision. It had become a larger, national reckoning, one that he had unwittingly ignited but could no longer control. The controversy surrounding the restaurant's decision to expel Caroline refused to fade. What Tom Bradford had initially seen as a moment of ideological defiance had instead become a national scandal, one that was growing increasingly difficult for him to control. As public pressure mounted, he attempted to defend his actions, doubling down in interviews and dismissing the criticism as partisan outrage. He framed himself as a business owner making a principled stand, arguing that his establishment had the right to refuse service to those he considered morally or politically objectionable. But the more he spoke, the more isolated he became. The backlash had moved beyond political circles and into the realm of public trust. For many Americans, the incident had become a symbol of the growing intolerance for differing opinions in public spaces. As more voices joined the conversation, it became clear that the concern was no longer just about one restaurant, it was about what kind of society the country was becoming. The restaurant, once a thriving hub for Washington elites and everyday patrons alike, saw a sharp decline in business. Conservative customers had already begun boycotting the establishment, but the damage did not stop there. Longtime regulars, even those who leaned left, grew uneasy at the idea that personal political beliefs could determine whether someone was welcome in a public setting. The restaurant's reputation had been irreversibly altered, not as an inclusive space, but as a battleground in an unnecessary ideological war. Behind the scenes, the restaurant's owners scrambled to contain the fallout. What had started as a single moment of political defiance had now become a liability, threatening the survival of their business. With mounting financial losses and growing unease from investors, they made a decision that was both inevitable and symbolic. Tom Bradford was fired. In an official statement, the restaurant issued a public apology, acknowledging that the decision to remove Caroline had been an overstep. They admitted that businesses should remain spaces for all customers, regardless of political or religious affiliation. While some praised the statement as a necessary course correction, others saw it as nothing more than damage control. Caroline, however, did not celebrate the outcome. She had never sought retribution, nor had she demanded an apology. From the very beginning, her focus had been on the larger issue at hand, the importance of upholding free expression and ensuring that ideological differences did not become grounds for exclusion. As the controversy reached its peak, she prepared for another White House press briefing. She knew the eyes of the nation were on her, waiting to see how she would respond. Some expected her to claim victory, to take satisfaction in the downfall of the man who had sought to humiliate her. But that was never her intention. Standing before the press, she spoke not of personal vindication but of national principles. She reminded the country that America had been built on the foundation of debate and disagreement, on the idea that differing viewpoints could coexist without one being silenced by the other. She warned of the dangers of political exclusion, of a future where people were denied opportunities, friendships, or even basic services based on who they voted for or what they believed. Her words resonated far beyond the walls of the briefing room. Across the country, people reflected on the deeper implications of what had unfolded. The moment was no longer just about one press secretary or one restaurant manager, it was about the kind of country Americans wanted to live in. As she stepped away from the podium, she glanced at her phone. Among the countless messages, one stood out. A young conservative woman had reached out, thanking her for proving that standing one's ground with grace and conviction was always the right choice. Caroline smiled, knowing that this moment was bigger than her. It was a reminder that true strength was not about silencing others but about standing firm, even when the world tried to push you down.